All it takes is some paper, some dice, some imagination, and a handful of people who promise not to get too invested in the ad-libbed reality they create together through a shared interactive storytelling experience fraught with hidden traps, psychological manipulation, immersive role-playing, and, in some cases, a bowl full of Sour Patch Kids. It's all fun and games even if someone loses an eye or the entire party gets killed. Hi, I'm Dan Larson, and this is the history of Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy-inspired role-playing game set within an era that, for the sake of brevity, we will call medieval times. Swords and sorcery, kings and castles, elves and dwarves, these are some of the general foundational elements that begin to paint the picture of the world that your character will live and most likely die in. Every experience is different, every player is different, every character is different, but they are all bound together by a uniform set of rules that governs everything from the amount of damage inflicted when a sword impacts armor, to the distance a heavily laden horse can travel in a single day, to the weather systems that can occur in a geographic area. The advancement of the story, the fate of all the characters in the world, and the world itself is determined moment by moment, turn by turn through the actions of the players in the game and the Dungeon Master, an individual thanklessly burdened with the task of bringing the supernatural world to life and serving as the tireless advocate of verisimilitude, combined with an infusion of pure chance by rolling dice. It is a communal, social gaming experience unlike any other. There is no score, no winner, and no way to predict the outcome. You play the game to play the game. There is only the experience, which you can earn points for. In 1956, Gary Gygax dropped out of high school during his junior year just after the death of his father. He joined the United States Marine Corps, but his enlistment didn't last long as he was diagnosed with walking pneumonia, given a medical discharge, and returned home to live with his mother in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, where he got a job as a shipping clerk for an insurance company. In 1958, game publisher Avalon Hill released a game called Gettysburg, which was developed around the American Civil War battle of the same name. It involved troop maneuvers on a map divided into squares at first, then later hexagonal grid. It is today considered the first modern historic war game, and 2 years out from his military discharge and departure from high school, Gary Gygax became obsessed with it and war games in general. In fact, he had begun to write about war games for fan groups and clubs focused on the hobby. He was so involved in the community, in the fandom, that in 1967 he helped create the International Federation of Wargaming, or IFW, which grew quickly and assimilated several smaller gaming organizations throughout the area. The IFW was soon followed by the Castle and Crusade Society, or C&CS, in 1970 as a subgroup of the IFW focused on medieval miniature wargaming. The C&CS had a publication called the Domesday Book, which featured the evolving and expanding rule sets that would form the foundation of a very specific set of combat rules for medieval-era games called Chainmail, co-written by Gygax and fellow game designer Jeff Perrin. In 1970, the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association, or LGTSA, another prominent wargaming group, was created and featured members including Gary Gygax, Jeff Perrin, and Gary's childhood friend Don Kay. That same year, a game publisher called Gidon Games reached out to the LGTSA and the IFW, which put them in touch with Gary Gygax and the variety of works he had already produced. Gidon Games tasked Gary with producing a series of guides called Wargaming with Miniatures. This collection of guides would ultimately include Gygax and Perrin's Chainmail and was released in 1971. It was also the first Gary Gygax product commercially available for sale and the first ever commercially available set of rules for wargaming that took place in a fantasy world thanks to a fantasy supplement that clearly drew influences from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and other fantasy writers. Chainmail would prove to be by far the most successful gaming guide in Gidon's Wargaming with Miniatures series. Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR, the company founded by Gary Gygax, Dave Kay, and Brian Bloom, published Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D, in 1974. The specific game mechanics and rule sets for D&D was an evolved effort over time from several writers and game designers over several years, each borrowing and modifying concepts to suit the needs of their games at the time. Ultimately, Dungeons & Dragons, as published by TSR, was credited to Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Dungeons & Dragons popularized the concepts of fantasy-based role-playing games. Yes, both Dungeons and Dragons played a prominent role, but along with that came the character sheet detailing a character's abilities, their character class, level, race, armor class, and alignment. It introduced monsters and magic items, hidden traps, and also assumed that you had a copy of the previously released game Chainmail To handle the rules for actual systems of measurement and combat encounters, it wasn't perfect. 1,000 copies of the original game were produced, hand-assembled, and put up for sale. Within a year, they had sold through the entire first run. A year later, in 1975, they would triple their sales. Things were moving along for Dungeons & Dragons, but it was clear that as the game's popularity increased, there was a need to revisit the rules, clarify, expand, and include some of the supplemental items that had been included in successive printings during the multiple releases in the first 3 years. In 1977, a new updated version called the Dungeons & Dragons Basic Set was released. It was written by J. Eric Holmes based on the works of Gygax and Arneson. The commercial goal was to broaden the field of potential gamers, to make it easier to start playing, to make it more accessible to players as young as 12 and everyone who didn't already have experience with the structure and format of wargames. The basic set was like a starter kit that would allow a group of players to advance their character through the first 3 levels of development, at which time they could move on to a new version of the game with a more elaborate system of rules. Dungeons & Dragons for advanced players, if you will. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or AD&D, was released in 1977, concurrent with the release of the basic set, and marked a point at which the franchise was not only expanding, but also splitting itself in two. And both properties would fluctuate for the next 4 decades, adding books, revising editions, consolidating, expanding, and contracting with the tastes and preferences of the players, whatever it took to stay relevant in the public consciousness and wallets. By 1980, TSR was selling 12,000 units per month, and by 1984, 10 years after the first set was hand-assembled, TSR sold 750,000 copies of Dungeons & Dragons. Millions of people were playing. Dungeons & Dragons was a cultural phenomenon.
Your dungeon master has placed you in a dreadfully precarious position. You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created. Your skin grows cold from your first glimpse at the enormous beast. It's a product of your imagination. Survival depends on a quick, decisive move. Your choices are limited. Stand and fight, or run. Use your lightning bolt. Victory is yours.
Win the treasure.
TSR Hobbies, Dungeons & Dragons games. Products of your imagination.
Where most people saw a game that inspired creativity and expanded the imagination, others saw the rising specter of the occult, Satanism, and suicide. They saw a gateway into evil, preparing an entire generation of youths to utilize evil powers hidden in the darkness. In August of 1979, Michigan State University student James Dallas Egbert III went missing. A private investigator named William Deere was hired to find him. Deere speculated that James had entered the maintenance tunnels below the university during a live-action session of role-playing, based on what he had learned about James's interests. The story gained significant media attention. It was later discovered that James had written a suicide note and then entered the tunnels, not with the intention to play D&D of any sort, but to take his own life. When he failed to kill himself, he ran away. After failing to take his own life a second time, James reached out to Deere and revealed the details of his disappearance and attempts at taking his own life. Deere promised James that he would keep his secret and released him into the custody of his uncle. A year later, James shot himself. In 1982, a sensationalized fictionalization of the James Dallas Egbert disappearance and suicide called Monsters and Mazes was adapted for television from the book of the same name. It starred Tom Hanks and helped to cement the idea in the public consciousness that D&D was commonly acted out in dangerous locations and that players had a hard time distinguishing the fantasy from the reality, and suicide was a potential result of the dark magic the game was channeling. 1982 was also the year that Patricia Pulling's own son shot himself. Patricia blamed her son's high school principal for exposing her son to D&D through games that were being held at the school. She sued the principal and TSR for making the game in the first place. When her lawsuits were dismissed, she started an organization called Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, or BAD, to try to bring attention to what she believed was a dangerous influence the game was having on kids who played it. She even appeared on an episode of 60 Minutes opposite Gary Gygax to advocate for the regulation of the game and to speak in her opinion about the danger of the game. Gary Gygax was there to refute her unfounded accusations.
This is make-believe, and nobody's murdered, and there's no violence there. I mean, to use an analogy with another game, who is bankrupted by losing a game of Monopoly? Nobody is, because the money is make-believe, the property is make-believe, and the bankruptcy is make-believe.
In 1984, William Deere, the private investigator who swore to keep James Dallas Egbert's secret before he killed himself, wrote a book called Dungeon Master, specifically to refute all the claims made by the book and TV movie Monsters and Mazes and all of the speculative media coverage. He put the blame squarely on James's parents as he described James as a kid who was actually struggling with drug abuse, depression, and his sexuality. D&D and suicide, the occult concepts that had been promoted by people like Patricia Pulling, had unfortunately been associated with D&D and everyone who played it. The media played up any story where a suicide or a murder was committed and there was a connection to D&D. But statistics suggest that with the amount of people that were playing Dungeons & Dragons, with the growing popularity of it, suicide rates would inevitably overlap. The American Association of Suicidology, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Health and Welfare of Canada have all concluded that there is no link between playing D&D and any increase in suicide, and no correlation between playing the game being detrimental to mental health.
Open the world of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons action figures. Strongheart, Bronze Dragon, Morduk, Nightmare. Discover a world of mystery and magic.
Stand back, Strongheart. You shall never have this treasure.
Evil is no match for good until we meet again.
Advanced Dungeons & Dragons action figures from LJN. Pure magic.
The passage of time, more than anything, has allowed D&D to rise above the negative associations of the game, because that era of kids has grown into mostly fine, upstanding adults, productive members of society, many of whom can't even spell occult without spell check activated. And anyway, through the 80s and into the 90s, the mainstream was already embracing the D&D phenomenon with all kinds of commercial products. Once again, capitalism saves the day. Halloween costumes, toys, Viewmaster reels, coloring books, pencil sharpeners, wallets, read-along storybooks, comic books, novels, magazines, computer games, and not for nothing, but 3 seasons of a Saturday morning cartoon. D&D's popularity would crest and trough over the years, those peaks and valleys usually associated with new edition releases and how those new releases were or were not embraced by fans of the game. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition was released in 1989, 3rd edition was released in 2000, which marked a few milestones. 1, it was the same year a D&D feature film was released. I still haven't seen it, but I'm sure producer Greg has. 2, it reunited the Dungeons & Dragons and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons games into a product that henceforth would just be called Dungeons & Dragons. 3, it was the first update published after TSR was purchased by Wizards of the Coast. And 4, it was the first update published after Hasbro bought Wizards of the Coast. Hasbro, till all are one. 4th edition was released in 2008. 5th edition, the edition that brought me back into the game, was released in 2014, coinciding with the 40th anniversary. Dungeons & Dragons is the best-known, best-selling, most influential RPG of all time with over $1 billion in sales. It has become a part of mainstream pop culture through references and actual plot significances in major motion pictures and on Netflix original programming and shows like Stranger Things. There are hundreds of gameplay podcasts, drunken and sober. There are millions of gamers playing and watching on services like Twitch. It has seen unprecedented sales growth since the release of the 5th edition in 2014, with 2017 marking its best year ever. And somewhere, right now, there are writers and producers working on a Dungeons & Dragons movie with a projected release date of July 23rd, 2021. Dungeons & Dragons is now a multi-generational experience and brand. The kids who started playing back in the 70s and 80s are now adults who have passed it on to their kids and, in some situations, actually play with their kids. The associations with the occult and suicide have long since faded into the background since video games took over the torch of corrupting the youth of the world. Am I sitting naturally? Thanks for watching. Please hit like, hit subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. Thank you very much to those of you who already are. Share this video, and if you're in the position to help the channel grow, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/toygalaxy, and let us know in the comments down below when you got into D&D, if you got into D&D. My brother and I tried to play back in like 1985, but all I wanted to do was make characters and shoot every NPC that got introduced. Shoot! You had a bow.